So in a moment, we'll do our 3 refuge chant. There may be a few of you who don't know it, so I just put the link in the chat. You can open that up if you need the words or the Pali words. And most of you know we do this chant slowly. It's a little different on Zoom because we can't really sing together. But it's really a beautiful thing for a group to do at the beginning of a Dharma evening, to take the refuges. And taking the refuges mean that we're valuing this capacity we have to be open, to be intimate with the conditions in the moment. And out of that comes Sangha, this capacity to be kind and connected and responsive in ways that are helpful, a compassionate life. So I'll put it in again for anybody who needs it. And then let's begin with the 3 refuges. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. So sitting comfortably, we'll take the first half an hour to meditate together, and with the theme of this course, turning the mind, turning the heart toward this attitude of metta, loving kindness, or this goodness of the heart. I came across a note I made a while back when I was reading a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Gathering Moss. She's a botanist and somebody who has studied the wisdom of the indigenous culture, and she's an indigenous person herself. And she quoted this Cheyenne elder in her book, and the little statement was, the best way to find something is not to go looking for it. And I think this is true with the quality of goodness that's here and now. When we go looking for it, there's this presumption that we know what we're looking for. So, in terms of arousing or discovering, connecting with this quality of goodness, it's useful to presume that it's already here. In a way, even our interest itself is good. Our willingness to listen to the quality of our heart, our body and mind right now, our willingness to be open, is very much the expression of metta. The willingness to be soft and receptive to what's happening. Our willingness not to struggle to find metta is an expression of metta. So even at this beginning part of our practice where we're told that we should arouse the attitude of friendliness or the attitude of kindness, this basic goodness, it's much more about willing to connect with what's already here. I often will say to myself when I'm doing metta practice, something like, I care enough right now, I care enough to be close to my experience. I care enough to connect with my life that's here and now. I care enough not to have to be afraid to feel what I'm feeling now. I care enough to relax. I care enough to be soft and patient. Care enough to be curious, humble, not pretending or imagining that I know already what's here and now. But instead I'm willing to be receptive, willing to be here with some humility. And tonight especially I want to talk about and encourage us all to reflect together on metta for oneself. Directing whatever goodness, whatever friendliness, whatever kindness that is here and now toward oneself, this life. So if it feels like the heart is opening with a beautiful and generous smile of goodness, then let's both be the radiant giver of that love, that goodness, and also the very grateful recipient of this love, this goodness. It's a really beautiful circle of giving and receiving. And as we've probably heard, the Buddha said, You can search the world over and you won't find anybody more deserving of love than oneself. Doesn't mean that others deserve it less, but they don't deserve it more. We are a perfectly suitable recipient for our love, for our goodness, for our care. And see if you can directly sense this expansive, generous, well-wishing toward oneself, both offering good wishes and receiving these good wishes. And remember, you don't actually have to verbalize any of this. Some people find it helpful to use some silent inner talk, inner words to support their metta practice. But it's useful to gravitate toward, at least at times, a practice that's not dependent on the repetition of a word or of a phrase, but to be willing to use words and phrases when they seem useful and supportive. There is this life here that is worthy of friendliness, worthy of good wishes. May this life, this body, this heart be at ease, happy and at ease. And just to appreciate, this is a sincere wish. May this life be at ease, this body, this sensitive heart, this thinking mind. May all of this be at ease, peaceful and at ease. And just see if you can sustain this generosity of friendliness toward oneself. Finding this positive feedback loop where it sustains itself, the good feeling, the rightness of it, the wholesomeness of it, makes it self-sustaining, with or without words. And we learn how to best abide or even bathe in the goodness, the good wishes we have for this life. May this heart, this body and mind be at ease. May wisdom and love protect me always. So we'll continue for a while in silence. I'll come back before the sit is over and offer a few more instructions, but really see if you can keep this metta for oneself in mind, with phrases or words, without phrases or words. and to find that place where it's self-supporting. It has its own power to continue this simple, wholesome goodness toward oneself. And we're including the totality of the body, the totality of our life. We're not afraid or excluding the embarrassing parts or the humiliating habits or things we see as bad. I'm not afraid to be close. I'm not afraid to include a wisdom and love protect me. May this life be at ease. And just that sense of a warm, boundless smile that understands it's not easy being a human being, and I care about this life. I'm not going to abandon. I'm not going to turn away. May this goodness continue and increase and never end. So we really want to feel into the bones that this metta, it's not idealistic. It's not pretending that we're someone that we're not. Is this life, this conditioned mind, this body, is it worthy of friendliness and kindness? Yes, it is. And we want to feel that directly. Just like anybody's life, any creature is worthy of kindness. This life is too. This sensitive heart, this thinking mind, this body. So just allowing that light, that inner light of goodness, or however you experience it, just allowing it to shine toward oneself. Appreciation and tenderness and friendliness. And notice, if you can, that sense of the heart becoming more and more established in this, or with this attitude, this goodness of the heart, benevolence of the heart. It's expansive and generous, and can even become boundless in the sense that nothing is left out. And notice how momentum can build as we keep the metta in mind. Just keeping it in mind. It's not about looking for it, but more about trusting that it's here and now. This capacity to care, capacity to be good is already here and now. And if some aversive pattern seems to be in the way, well, probably that aversive pattern is worthy of tenderness and kindness and understanding. Oh, sometimes it's like this. The mind has great doubt, or the mind feels unworthy, or whatever the pattern might be. I care about this tightness, this heaviness of heart. I care enough to be close. I care enough to include it. You too belong. This painful emotion, this disturbing thought, this aching knee, or whatever it might be. Metta is not afraid of the conditions because metta knows how to include everything. That's its very nature. And for the last few minutes, just experiment with a more radical trust of this goodness. So we can drop any sense that I'm doing the practice of metta. And it's much more about relaxing back, abiding in this goodness, even if it is very subtle, just trusting that this heart is good. And may this goodness continue and increase and reveal its simple but boundless nature until we sense that every part of the body, mind, every aspect of this moment, the space of the present moment itself is all infused, suffused with metta, this goodness, this non-fear and non-aversion. And we'll just sit together in silence for another 3 minutes or so. I will abide, pervading the all-encompassing world with metta, this goodness, abundant, exalted, boundless, free from fear, free from ill will. I will abide. And when you feel ready, just adjust your body. Stretch a little if that's helpful. So I'm assuming everyone got the message. As you can see, I don't have my mask on, so I'm teaching in the office. We do have, I don't know, at least a handful of people in the meditation hall, and of course, all of you at home. And this is week 2 of our winter Buddhist studies class, where we're looking at the divine abodes, the Brahma Viharas, these 4 beautiful emotions. And it's, in a sense, in the early Buddhist tradition, this is the way, probably for most of us, the easiest way to get a taste of a mind that is free, liberated from the tormenting habits that mostly torment us, all the limiting, self-centered habits. And I like how Venerable Analayo, in one of his articles, he points out, like, from the early Buddhist tradition, there are people like who are sick on their deathbed or whatever, who can experience this profound state where their mind, the contraction of greed, hatred, and delusion just isn't there. And it doesn't require some kind of meditative excellence or profound awakening. It just means really trusting the emotion or attitude of love, or whatever word you prefer to use: kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, equanimity, these natural capacities. But they need help, right? And it's not, the help they need isn't that I've got to generate that attitude. It's more the help it needs to be recognized. And then the harder part is it needs to be kept in mind. And, this is the homework last week, was to be interested in both aversive states and what am I getting, how am I trying to feed on my aversion when I'm afraid, like, what am I getting from that fear when I'm identified with fear, or if I'm angry or hateful or irritated. It's like, what keeps that in motion in my heart? What's the loop, the feedback loop, right? Because all the different flavors of aversion are a little bit like a drug. There's something juicy. I think I mentioned last week, the Buddha's phrase was, it's murderously sweet, this cycling of aversion. Whether for some of us, sometimes it has more the flavor of fear. Other times it's more of kind of a nihilistic boredom, like, oh, nothing matters. Other times it's like that hot rage or hate, or tight self-righteousness, condemnation. So there are lots of different flavors of aversion. And it's really important that we distinguish aversion as a contraction and a way we alienate ourselves from the present moment. We get in that loop, that disconnected loop. To distinguish that from what could be a very wholesome and fierce, compassionate action, where we speak loudly and someone might even think we're angry. We might borrow some of the, gestures of anger. I learned this as a classroom teacher, elementary school. Like, sometimes I had to raise my voice. I mean, maybe if I'd continued longer in the field, I would have found other ways. I wasn't proud of it. And a lot of the times when I got angry, I was just angry. There was nothing wholesome about it, or even that effective about it. But toward the end of my time working in the schools, I actually realized, like, I have to be able to not be attached to being a calm and balanced person, because it got in the way of responding appropriately in a helpful way. Sometimes the appropriate response is very loud, because what needs to happen is you have to get people's attention, and this is what they'll respond to. So I want to say that because clearly there are times when fierceness, a fierce response, is the appropriate, generous, compassionate response. So when we talk about aversive and studying aversion, how it moves and how we feed on it like a drug, we seem to get something, but we never get satisfied with it. It's sort of like we get a little of that murderously sweet stuff, but it also fries us. And the thing is, when we're really in an aversive state, identified with it, it's just like we look for more reasons to be aversive. I'm sure you've noticed that. If you haven't, really study aversion in all its ways, whether for you it's more fear, or for you it's more of a hot, aggressive kind of aversion that you tend toward. But get to know it and see honestly, really be resolved to see when the mind is identified, attached to these aversive states, what gets set in motion in my heart? What tendencies get strengthened? What kind of character or way of perceiving gets more deeply established in terms of my habits? We should be interested in that. And again, remember, this is not about judging ourselves. It's just wanting to understand cause and effect, the karma of aversion. What are the karmic fruits of aversion? And then we'll do just the opposite, right? Same basic analysis with metta. What does it feel like when the mind is established in metta? What's the quality? And to really get a sense of the liberation, like when the mind, and maybe you had a flavor of this during the guided sit this evening, when we're in that balance of metta, that it's also just like anger and hate and fear and aversion, it has its own coherent feedback mechanism, so that it tends to keep replicating. Aversion begets aversion. Metta begets metta, same thing. And we want to really understand, we want to resolve to notice those organic, ordinary moments when the heart is in a non-aversive state. And there's just a openness and kind of a generous presence, a basic goodness, a heart that naturally is inclined to include whatever it's sensing internally, externally. Oh yeah, it's like this. Willing to be close. Like that's really the, the essential characteristic or ingredient of love. Metta is this capacity to include, to be close, to not be afraid, to not be averse. And I really recommend that as you're getting to know metta as it shows up, in these organic ways in your days, to really practice seeing it as the absence. The mind is empty of aversion. It's empty of fear. I mean, temporarily, right? It won't last forever, but to really notice, hey, I don't notice any fear right now. I don't notice any irritation right now. There's none of that controlling tendency active right now in my mind, in my heart. Because that may be a more practical way to get intimate with metta, is to notice what's not there. In part because we have a habit of being really idealistic and romantic about love, about goodness, about kindness. We have these images or these ideas, and then we try to fit that, and then we judge ourselves when we don't, and it can be a real setup. And in particular, the feedback, the coherent feedback loop of metta. So when the heart is somewhat at least established in this tender, friendly, appreciative balance, right? Equanimous balance. And it's like that way of perceiving, like instead of perceiving threats and kind of vigilant and really looking for what are the threats, where are the evil ones. It's not, that mind isn't dumb, like it doesn't pretend that there aren't dangers out there, but it has a way of recognizing the dangers, the threats, but in this loving way. Yeah, there are threats. And because I care about my life, I'm going to avoid them. And because I care about this life, I'm not going to bother to hate the threats. Who does that help? Right? We don't have to throw creatures or other humans out of our heart because they might pose a threat to us. We just need to stay away from them. And staying away from them doesn't depend on hating them or fearing them. And this is something we do for our own benefit. It's not like, I mean, maybe it's a gift for them to not hate them, like people or animals or situations that feel threatening to us. But first and foremost, it's a gift to ourselves, not to hate them, not to fear them, but to take care of ourselves because we care and we don't want to be harmed, right? So how does that land with people, this sense that that the goodness is here? I really encourage you in the small groups that we'll have for the last 20 minutes. Dave Braun has volunteered to coordinate that. So about 8:40-ish, I'll make Dave the host. But I heard your cat, Freda. But not just in the small groups, but just generally, this is such a useful conversation about, it seems sort of weird that we'd say to a good friend at dinner or taking a walk with a good friend, and just share with them, you know what, the other day I noticed my heart was really good. It would sound conceited. And it's so unfortunate because it's really useful for us to point that out for ourselves and to point that out for each other. Just to acknowledge, because that capacity of goodness, it's not actually personal. Just like being angry isn't personal. These are just tendencies, and tendencies that have consequences. And that's really, that more neutral way is really the right way to do the investigation. Like, well, what is the karma of the mind being identified with aversion in all of its various manifestations? What is the karma, cause and effect, of keeping in mind metta and learning to really appreciate the pleasure of that open and inclusive, generous presence? What does that set in motion? Who do I become when I keep it in mind? As opposed to who do I become when I keep my anger and hate and fear in mind, and sort of use that way of perceiving. You know how it is sometimes when we're hurting, we just keep looking for things that bother us, the things that scare us. Because it's like unconsciously mostly, there seems to be a need for me to protect my idea that life sucks, or that life is bad, or that somebody or things are out to get me, right? And there's this unacknowledged dependence on my worldview. So unconsciously, the mind is just looking for data that reinforces that fixed idea. You know, if we have a bad incident on the freeway where someone cuts us off, you know, it's like after it's passed, we're looking for other jerks out there. You know, anybody who makes a mistake or anything that even comes close to being a mistake. Oh, there's another person with road rage. Never does it occur to us to notice, like, how's my heart doing? You know, what is this setting in motion? What's the karma of the mind identified in the way that it's identified? It's almost like we're doing, you know, a scientific study where it's not so much that we purposefully choose to be aversive, but as long as we're going to be aversive, let's collect some data and see what it sets in motion. And then hopefully there are times when these wholesome attitudes of loving kindness and compassion and appreciation and the beautiful radiant balance of equanimity are present. And then we'll collect some data like, how does this work? What does this set in motion for me? Because here's the theory to check out. When we infuse our life with this kind of curiosity, and this is this famous sutta where the Buddha talks about his own practice before he had his deep insight, his awakening. And he said, you know, it occurred to me, maybe I should divide up my thoughts in terms of what's wholesome and what's unwholesome. So when there are thoughts of generosity, thoughts of kindness and compassion, or thoughts of hate, you know, I would just categorize them. Like, that's skillful. That's not skillful. That's not helpful. And it really means to be discerning the consequence of when the mind is identified or perceiving in this way versus perceiving in that way. What does it set in motion? And it really infusing our life with this kind of discernment, this interest in the Brahma Viharas. And of course, that then implies an interest in the opposites of compassion, the opposites of appreciation, like jealousy and envy, the opposites of equanimity, like reactivity, opposite of friendliness, which would be hate and irritation, fear. Opposite of compassion is cruelty, right? And justifying aggression, including toward ourselves. It doesn't have to be toward another. And when we infuse our life with just this interest, it really breaks our heart open, you know, to see, or like even to see self-hatred and self-judgment. So I mentioned during the guided sit, this often repeated teaching from the Buddha, you can search the whole universe and not find a single being more worthy of love than yourself. Since each and every person is so precious to themselves. Excuse me, sorry about that. Since each and every person is so precious to themselves, let the self-respecting harm no other being. And isn't that an interesting way to open our heart? You know, I mentioned at the end of the guided sit and talked about this last week too, and it's in that instructions that I included in the emails. The fourth stage of the practice, or the third stage, is to move toward a boundless, everybody, everything is included. And one way to get there is to really sense like this life is worthy of love. And then we realize when we bump into other people, oh, they also really love themselves. And if they don't, they should. Because you see how it's like, oh, in the same way I've learned how to really take care of myself, even the habits of my mind that I find humiliating, but I'm not afraid of them anymore. I mean, that's a sign of good practice. Ajahn Sumedho has such a powerful story, being one of the first Westerners to ordain, and then having kind of a big following here in England, and generally in the West, a lot of Westerners practicing and ordaining, both women and men, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and really big community at Amaravati, and then many other monasteries started to form this Western Thai forest tradition. And then there, Ajahn Sumedho was sort of this respected head of this huge movement. And he noticed that, he was, in a way that he considered very petty, being jealous of these other nuns and monks. And as they developed and became, respected and wise, and, and then he noticed, I'm jealous. And he was just totally did not like being jealous of the other monks and nuns, because he was, in the early Buddhist tradition, especially, it's all by seniority. So not only was he the abbot but he was the senior person. So everyone, he had the respect and power, and but he just felt like, I just have to get rid of this jealousy. And of course it didn't work, because you can't suppressing these, less than wholesome habits just sends them underground, and then they sprout up in all kinds of neurotic ways. So after some time, he talks about how he had to really befriend, he had to be a friend to this habit of jealousy. He had to welcome it. He had to keep it close, not be afraid of being the senior monk who's jealous. And I tell you, wouldn't it be transforming if, there's 140 of us probably, between those in person here and those online. And if we took the time for each of us to share one of these despicable, embarrassing, humiliating tendencies that we've begun at least to befriend, and not have to hide from ourselves. We're not saying that we're okay letting everybody else know, but we've made a little bit more peace with it. It might be some part of your body, or it might be some, whatever that we do when no one else is around. And the question is, how do we relate to that? How do we hold that? Do we use it as a way to beat ourselves up and hate ourselves? Or is it a monument of the strength of our love? Like, yeah, I'm not afraid of that either. That also can be included. That does not take away from my love. Doesn't mean I don't see cause and effect. So if I have some habit that has some consequences that are harmful to me, doesn't mean I don't read cause and effect, just because I'm not going to hate myself because this is happening. Because wisdom and love understands, yeah, sometimes it's like this. Sometimes the human mind does this, thinks in this way, acts in this way. Can I care about this? Yeah, I can care about this. Another place in the suttas, there's this phrase, one should not give up one's own welfare, even for the sake of much welfare for others. And it sounds a little strange when we hear it that way, like, yeah, my well-being is more important than yours. But the point the Buddha is making with the statement is, it's wrong to think that caring for ourselves, taking care of ourselves, comes at the expense of taking care of others. That we can really care about our well-being without, not, caring for our well-being doesn't depend on us not caring about everybody else's well-being. In fact, caring deeply, deeply about our own well-being, as the Buddha said earlier, makes it easier for us to care about everybody else's well-being. Like he said, in the same way that my life is precious to myself, everybody else's life, even a mosquito's life, is precious in their own way to themselves. Nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to be hurt. Nobody wants to be dismissed. And that's that's really the crucible of metta practice, this this movement towards including everyone, not feeling like we have to throw anybody out. Let me read a little from Ajahn Sumedho. I included an article that has some of the same teachings, but maybe not exactly the same story. This is from Nothing is Left Out, and it's a chapter in The Voices of Insight. It's a collection that Sharon Salzberg put together when Ram Dass, some of you know Ram Dass, he had made quite a splash in bringing Eastern teachings to the West in the late 60s and 70s. And good friends of people like Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg, and did a bunch of practice at IMS over the years too. He recently passed away. But when he had a stroke, Sharon did this book. So the funds that the book generated went to support Ram Dass. And Ajahn Sumedho had a chapter there called Nothing is Left Out. And this is from that chapter. And he's talking about basing our practice on generosity and non-harming, and really developing the mind. And he talks about this process is one of purification. In practice, we can begin to release the negative emotions and impurities we hold within us. As they start to rise up into our consciousness, if we are simply mindful of these unpleasant states, and we can see them with kindness and acceptance, they begin to move away. But as long as we take the view that something is wrong with us, as long as we identify with them, we will push them down again, saying, oh, I mustn't think like that. Then the purification process cannot take place. Because of our aversion and refusal to accept them, that negativity stay with us and begin to accumulate. And this can shock us and surprise us, because here we are, we're a devoted student of the Buddhist teachings, and we sit every day or almost every day and come to classes and, do all the right things. And what do we start to notice? Because the practice is starting to have a foothold in the mind isn't willing to suppress stuff as much as it might have in the past. So these patterns, they start to come out into the sunshine of awareness, and we see our despicable thoughts, our despicable emotions. Doesn't mean we're acting out and doing terrible things in the world, but what's moving in our minds and heart, we create more space for it to be real, basically. And he goes on, he writes, so we can actually be glad when unpleasant states keep coming up in our meditation practice. By having metta for the wretched creatures we lock away inside us, we're opening the door of the prison. We're letting them go, and we release them out of compassion rather than the desire to be rid of them. If we contemplate the difficulties in this way, they can be borne more easily, because we're looking at them with wisdom rather than seeing them as me or my problems. As long as they are mine, I can only hate myself for thinking or feeling a particular way. The spurious logic, only a bad person would think such bad thoughts. so therefore I'm a bad person. Then we feel tremendous guilt and self-aversion. Once we change our relationship to these negativities by moving from ignorance to wisdom, then whatever horrible thoughts or feelings may enter our mind is simply what it is. We are not denying it. Instead, with metta, we allow it to be. Because again, what is the essential characteristic of metta? Metta knows how to include the way it is. Metta doesn't have a problem with things being the way they are. And in particular, tonight, we're talking about opening to our whole life. There's a couple more sentences here. In that willingness to let things be what they are, we liberate ourselves from them. As we become increasingly skillful at releasing these habits, there is a sense of lightness because the heart isn't burdened by guilt, self-dislike, blame, and all the rest. Clinging to negative states, identifying with them, only creates endless neurotic problems about what we're feeling or thinking. And of course, if I think I have to suppress some thought, you see, it's totally self-view. If I understand that these negativities, these humiliating aspects of my character, personality, tendencies of mind, if they're understood as just what they are tendencies of this mind. They are unskillful tendencies of this mind. They feel like this, they look like this. So there's a real overlap between the wisdom that understands the impersonal nature of these unhelpful, unwholesome habits of mind, and the love that can include them. Oh yeah, honey, sometimes it's like this. And then the last paragraph in this essay that Ajahn Sumedho wrote, he writes, this is a process of changing our attitude from, I don't like this in myself, I want to get rid of it, to, oh, so this is what I'm feeling. And having patience and a willingness to experience what is in the present moment. This is being willing to feel jealousy or anxiety and take an interest in it as experience. Because that which is aware is not worried, is not angry, is not the condition that is present. We start to develop confidence in this state of pure awareness. And this is the great thing, the more we understand mindfulness, the more we understand there really isn't this wise, pure awareness without metta. That's one of the reasons we do the formal practice, is because the formal practice of loving kindness is because it just is naturally integrated into our awareness practice. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning, don't go looking, don't try to find it, just trust that it's here. In the same way that that awareness isn't something we do, it's something we notice, and we develop it by recognizing it. Metta has that same nature. We develop it by keeping it in mind. And when a lot of aversion shows up, we don't feel like, oh, I'll do my metta practice once I deal with this aversion. We realize I can have metta for whatever the aversive state is. If we really hate doing metta practice, we can, really being disgusted with Buddhist metta practice is like this. Okay, I feel this kind of dismissal of this practice, and I care about that. Because we can have metta for the aversion, right? Because metta includes. I was meeting with someone today, a long-time practitioner, they might actually be in the program tonight, and they reminded me of, or told me something that Ajahn Chah said that's, I think, just beautiful. A little teaching. What's in the way is the way. That's just a great little teaching. So the aversion, what's in the way, is the way. Like that's exactly where to bring metta, to realize there is metta. So instead of this idea of you and I having to become perfect practitioners, perfect human beings, perfect partners, perfect parents, perfect citizens, perfect activists, we can get interested in what's in the way of being a perfect human being. And in a funny way, perfection is not being afraid to be imperfect. And like figuring out, well, what do we do when we're an imperfect human being? I love this little Zen poem, Isa, uh, a Zen, Japanese Zen poet. And he had a lot of loss. His son, his firstborn, died at birth, and then a few years later had a daughter who died shortly after they were born. And I think it was after those two losses he wrote this famous poem. Let's just see, I have it written down somewhere here. I want to get it right. Oh, here it is. This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet, or another translation, the world of dew is a world of dew, and yet. So it really brings together, how ephemeral everything is, out of control, not manageable, and yet, life keeps touching the heart deeply. We're moved by so much. Things really hurt. When we embarrass ourselves, it really, like, even if we're really wise, we've done a lot of practice, then do something stupid and in front of others, and in front of others who you really value their respect. And then notice how strong that feeling can be that we feel. Or, your good friend, goes on retreat and they just have one great sit after another, and they come back and they look like one of the radiant ones, all shiny and light and happy and on fire with the Dharma. And it feels like, for me, I've just been slogging around for years. How come I don't get any of that interesting stuff? And nothing ever good happens in my practice, right? And to be interested in, like, well, can metta include that? It's just so compelling. But the deal is, of course, to really trust, like, we have to let go of the identification of being the victim of our own bad habits, for example, like that's who I am, to realizing, no, there's right here and now, for no good reason, not because I did something clever in a Dharma sense, but right here and now, there's a heart that can include this, that can say yes to this. And if you want to call that wisdom, or you want to call that metta, but the key is to keep that in mind, because it really has the flavor of liberation. There's a sense that, try as I might, I can't really break it. I can't spoil Dharma. I can forget it, right? We can get lost in the weeds of our life, aversive patterns, obsessive patterns, greed storms, lust storms, that can take us away for months at a time, generally. I mean, in a general sense. But as soon as we're reminded, as soon as we have supporting conditions, we find the heart that can say yes. Sometimes it's like this. And I'm not afraid to see and feel what's here. And even if I do flinch, and I am afraid to see and feel what's here, love, wisdom can turn and go, hey, I care about that too. I care about not being able to show up to my life right now, that I have to actually turn away. I care enough to actually find a relatively skillful escape. Maybe I'll call my friend who always makes me laugh. or maybe I'll get on the, make myself some soup. So in the small groups tonight, I recommend that you just share a little bit about the integrity of these loops of aversion that you see in your life, and the integrity of times when you felt that inner goodness and developed maybe a little bit deeper trust in it, confidence in it. Before I pass it over to Dave to break up the small groups, and Tim here in person to break up the small group into small groups, just a reminder for those who haven't been in the Buddhist studies, we consider these small groups sort of a little bit of a sacred space. We hold in confidence whatever shared there. Each person gets a couple minutes to share uninterrupted. Even if that person runs out of something to say, the other two people hold the space until their 2 minutes is up. Thereabouts, 2.5 minutes each person. Then there should be 5 to 8 minutes left at the end for just a more open discussion. That's the time to ask clarifying questions if you didn't quite understand what somebody was sharing about. But otherwise, in the opening go round, just give people that 2 minutes. And a nice thing to do is just be in your body, just be present in your body, even on our Zoom small groups. And then Dave will bring people back who are on Zoom just for a brief 30-second coming together as the whole group before everyone says goodnight to each other at 9 o'clock Central Time. Okay, so nice to be with everybody. Hope to see